I'll be reading Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 through 20. And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age."
Good morning. It's good to see everybody here this morning. And Jeff, you probably shouldn't have told the Kentucky fan that the Duke fan was preaching this morning. He's probably already turned YouTube off, you know. But no, I hope he is still watching. And it has been just a wonderful time so far this weekend with you all. I greatly appreciate your invitation to be here. I've been looking forward to this for some time. And if you have your Bibles with you this morning, go ahead and open up to Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17. And essentially, what we're going to look at today is definitely my favorite verse or favorite chapter in all of Acts, because it gives us good evangelistic fundamentals. And last night, just for those of you who weren't here, we talked about the situation that the church finds itself in the 21st century. And the first thing that I asked last night was, by a show of hands, how many people believe that society has become more religious than it was 50 years ago? And shocker, nobody raised their hand. Because we've seen, over the years that society has become more secular. And here's something that I really want to press on you this morning, is that we are called to seek and save the lost regardless of the culture that we find ourselves in. See, we can choose whether or not we seek and save the lost. We can't choose the culture that we evangelize to. Never realized that? I mean, it'd be great if we could just all say, man, I really wish that we could take a time machine back 2,000 years ago, and I'd be right there with Peter and the apostles, and we'd be evangelizing in the first century, and we could experience that, and we could feel that, and we could be a part of that. Well, last time that I checked, souls were just as lost then as they are now, regardless of the culture that we find ourselves in. And Acts chapter 17 is an amazing sermon, is an amazing conversation that Paul has with a group of people who don't look like him, who don't walk like him, who don't talk like him, who don't even believe the same things that he believes. And so what is it about Paul that makes him so effective as an evangelist? And there's two words, and you can see them on the screen. There's two things that Paul does exceptionally well throughout the book of Acts. There's two things that Jesus did exceptionally well throughout his time on earth. And there's two things that you and I must be exceptionally well at if we're going to reach the next generation, if we're going to be effective evangelists. And that's to connect and to communicate. That's the only point that I have this morning, is to connect and to communicate, because we realize, and some of you have experienced this in your own families, that this is the view of what happens when your son, your daughter, your granddaughter, your brother, your sister, your mother surveys the culture and desires the culture more than the Christ. We talked about last night how it seems like this younger generation is walking away from not just Christ, but religion in general at a cyclic rate. But they make up the largest people group in all of the world. And so how do we prevent these types of things from happening? Or how can we stop this cyclical rate of people leaving the church? And one of the things that we can do is we can do this right here. See, we talked about last night where culture is. Culture is so individualistic and so isolated that sometimes that seeps into the church. And so the church, which was once amazing at doing this right here, is now so occupied. I said this last night. Sometimes I wonder if the church is just a bunch of individuals that happen to meet at the same place at a specific time during the week. Well, I've got my schedule. Well, I've got my work. Or, well, I've got my family. Or, well, and I'll throw shade at myself, here. Or, well, I got that Duke basketball game. There was a time in my life where that dominated. And it prevents me and it prevents you from doing this right here. This is what we need to get back to, is this one-on-one conversations with people. But, how in the world do I do that? Well, we turn to the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 17. We see that as Paul has left Berea, and they've gotten into a little bit of trouble, and so they ship Paul off to Athens. And Paul was waiting for Timothy and Silas to come to him. And notice what the text says there in Acts chapter 17, 16. It says, "Now while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he twiddled his thumbs because there was nothing to do and he was bored." Why are y'all laughing? Because that's not what the text says, is it? Now, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw the city was full of idols. So Paul gets into Athens, instead of doing nothing and sitting on the dock of the bay. Somebody should write a song about that. It'd be a number one hit. I promise you it would be. And as Paul is sitting there, he surveys Athens. And the one thing that he sees in Athens is that there's nothing but idols. And his spirit is provoked. It means that his spirit was stirred because of what he saw. And what did he see? He saw a bunch of people who were really religious, but they didn't have Jesus. Sound familiar? I mean, think about this. Whether you know this or not, you live in this place called the Bible Belt. And it doesn't matter what city you go to, there's probably a church somewhere. And there are probably people who go there. And there's probably, if you go a couple minutes away from here, there's a city called Atlanta. And there's a bunch of people there. And you know this. And there's a bunch of people who believe a lot of stuff. And they, in every way, are very religious, and we'll talk about this later, but they don't have Christ. And so Paul says, it says there that he was provoked. It says that he was provoked. And so here's the thing. When we see the state of our community, are you stirred to connect with our community? Paul is in a foreign place with people he doesn't know. And as he surveys the city, his heart is provoked. Why? Because he cares deeply about the people in the city. Well, how in the world can you care deeply about people that you've never met? How in the world can you care deeply about people you've never talked to? How in the world can you care deeply about people that you've never had a meal with? Because he's compelled by Christ. Because is it not true that Christ deeply cared about people that maybe he didn't really have a strong connection with? I mean, there are a few times where Jesus in the Gospels where he dines with tax collectors and sinners. And let me just ask the question rhetorically. How many times do you think that he just found himself with them from the time that he was a little boy? Not a lot, but he saw that each one of them bore the imago Dei, the image of God. They were image bearers of God, and because they were image bearers of God who didn't have a relationship with God, he had to be with them. Let me ask you a question. Do you see people like that? Do you look at your family? Do you look at your friends at school? Do you look at your classmates? Do you look at your work buddies? Do you look at your extended family? And do you see past the flesh and the bone? Do you see the soul in people? And so sometimes what happens is the only thing that we see with people is what's revealed by the flesh and the bone, and the clothes, and the hair, and the makeup. And sometimes if they lack in some of those areas, we say, I don't want to be with those people. Those people don't deserve my time. And this is how we do it in the South. We say something like, well, bless their heart. They need Jesus, bless their heart. But what if the only example of Jesus they ever see is you and me? If you want to be an effective evangelist, if you want the church to grow, you've got to look at the people in your community, and your heart has to be stirred to reach them. Your job, your goal, your mission, your passion should be to see people far from God filled with life in Jesus Christ. That's the goal of the church. And so Paul, what he does, this is what Paul sees. He sees this city of Athens, and he is provoked. And notice what it says there, or what it says here on the slide. Paul surveyed the city before seeking to connect with people in the city. Let me ask you this question, and I'm going to ask you a lot of questions, okay? Do you know the people in your city? Do you know the demographics? Do you know where the high society of the city is and where the low society of the city is? And do they know you? Individually and collectively. And it's cliche, but it's true. But let's just say, and I hope that it doesn't happen, but let's just say tomorrow the doors of this place closed. Would anybody in the community know, and would anybody in the community care? Would people read the paper and be like, oh my goodness, the Conyers Church of Christ is closing the doors. They've done so much for my life, they brought me to Jesus. Or would they just say, oh, well, just another church? The church has to be so instrumental, and the church has to be so impactful in the community that people know about it. It's the old saying, if a tree falls in the woods and nobody's there to hear it, does it really make a noise? And if the church is in a city and the city doesn't know that it's there, is the church really in the city? Is the church really in the lives of people? Are you connected with people who don't look like you, that don't talk like you, that don't walk like you, but need what you have? And that's the story of Jesus. And so notice this here. It says, the next thing that Paul did, he says, so it reasoned in the synagogues with the Jews and devout persons in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Now look at the groups of people that Paul is dealing with. He's dealing with people who do look like him, the Jews in the synagogue. Devout persons, people who are just generally religious. And in the marketplace, he was there every day. And we don't have a particular marketplace unless you got a farmer's market, right? But your marketplace is where you are. Your marketplace is your work. Your marketplace is your school. Your marketplace is the family reunion that you're kind of like nervous about going to because there's some people there that you just don't get along with, okay? That's your marketplace. And whether you know it or not, whether we believe it or not, we live in the marketplace of ideas as well. And could you just for a second, could you imagine being the guy in the marketplace that sees Paul coming down? The guy that's just trying to sell some meat sacrificed to idols, and he says, oh goodness, here comes this Paul guy again. I know what I'm about to get. He's about to come over here and he's about to talk to me about Jesus. Could you imagine being that guy? That would be an interesting thing. But notice, how often did Paul do that while he was in Athens? Every day. And that may not mean that every day he's talking to somebody about Jesus. It may just mean he's walking up to people and asking really good questions about why they believe what they believe. Or maybe he's going up to the person in the marketplace and saying, hey, I'd like to buy something from you. And they ask him how his day was going. He goes, well, I'm just meditating on what we talked about the other day when I went to visit the synagogue. Well, what did you talk about the other day when you went to visit the synagogue? I'm so glad that you asked. And so Paul was there every day. And evangelism is a lifestyle, brothers and sisters. It is not a calendar event. We have made evangelism a calendar event. We've said, we look and we see, and we say, well, what can we do this year? Okay, let's have an personal evangelism workshop. Let's go to the personal evangelism conference. And we have so systematized, and I'll just make up a word, preachers can do that, calendarized evangelism that we talk about it, but we don't do it nearly as much as we talk about it. I mean, just think about how that will work in your own family, right? If you went to your kid and you said, hey, I need you to clean your room. Okay? When I come back, your room better be clean. And then, a couple minutes later, you knock on the room door, you open up, you say, why isn't your room clean? And your kid goes, well, we were going to go to the cleaning your room workshop, and we were going to talk about, how to actually clean the room. Where does stuff go and how do we do it? Because we know you don't want us to just shove everything under the bed, even though that's a tactic, And then you just look at it and frustrated, like, I told you to clean your room. You better clean your room in 5 minutes. Come back, knock on the door, and say, the room's still dirty. What are you doing? Well, we didn't go to the clean your room workshop, but we looked up what cleaning your room means or would look like in Greek. And so we're just still studying that. Okay, I'm getting frustrated. You need to clean your room. You come back later. Why is your room not clean? Well, Dad, we were going to get some people together, and we were going to get together, Sunday, and we were just going to talk about, the Greek and the workshop, and we were just going to kind of ruminate on what a clean room would do for you guys if it were actually cleaned. You see what I'm getting at, don't you? They're talking about cleaning their room. They're looking it up in the Greek. They're going to the workshop, but what are they never actually doing? They're never actually cleaning the room. And we've treated evangelism the same way in the church. It's a really good calendar event. But not enough people are actually doing it. Oh yeah, by the way, the answer to evangelism is not, that's what we hired the preacher for. Because we're all ministers of reconciliation to the world. So it just doesn't fall on Jeff, it just doesn't fall on the deacons, it just doesn't fall on the elders. It is a lifestyle. And that's what we see from Paul over and over and over again. It says here in verse 17 that he went to the synagogues and went to the marketplace every day. 5 times in 3 chapters it says that Paul went to the marketplace, or as he traveled through the cities, he told people about Jesus. And we are so scared. It's good. We've got 4 walls, a roof, and a people that believe the same things that we believe, so we can talk about Jesus all day. But I'm scared that society and culture has trained us and conditioned us to not talk about Jesus because that's the easy way out. And so notice what it says next. It says, that Paul was intentional. He looked for people even when they weren't looking for him. You ever thought about that? How many people in the marketplace said, man, I really just got to go find this Paul guy? I mean, we don't see that in the text. It was Paul that was intentional. Paul was provoked, he was stirred, so he went looking for people even if they weren't looking for him. And we have this approach sometimes to evangelism. Well, if they just walk in the door on Sunday morning, I'll talk to them, which we don't. Because after all, that's why the preacher stands there and greets people. That's why you have them fill out contact cards. So I don't have to talk to them. So I don't have to say anything to them. I can greet them and say, welcome to the assembly, and maybe if they hear something that they like, they'll stay for the next sermon or the next service. But here's the thing that people crave. Whether you know this or not, people crave relationship. People crave knowing and understanding and get to knowing people who are not like them, who appreciate them, who care for them, who hear them. And who are willing, whether you know it's not, who are willing them to tell them the truth even when it's uncomfortable. And that's why Paul went after people, is because guess what? He knew that they needed the truth, and so he went to look for people even if they weren't looking for them. This sounds very familiar, like when Jesus said, I'm going to make you fishers of men. Anybody here ever been fishing before? Okay, I was about to be like, man, it's Georgia. Nobody's ever been fishing? What is happening here? Notice, Jesus said, I'm going to make you fishers of men. And what do you got to do in order to fish? You just don't sit in the pond and wait for, here, fishy, fishy, fishy. You don't do that. What do? You gather a rod, you got a reel, you got some bait, you got a hook, and you cast that bad boy. And you wait, and you reel. And you'll even, some of y'all, I don't know, some people will spend hundreds of dollars on lures that are really shiny. Why? Because they want to lure the fish in. They don't wait for the fish to come to them. They do everything they can to go to the fish. Some people go fly fishing, right? Where they put on their waders and they go out into the water where the fish are and they cast where the fish are. We have to be fishers of men. We can't wait for people to come to us. We have to go to people. All right? And so that's exactly what Paul does here. And so notice what happens. Some of the Epicureans and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. And some said, what does this babbler wish to say? Others said, he seems to be preaching foreign deities because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. Now, what you have here are Epicureans and Stoics, and Epicureans are the people who say, eat, sleep, be merry, for tomorrow you die. And the Stoics are like, well, if you show any emotion at all, that's weakness. So notice this. Two people that see the opposite spectrum of the way to live life both agree that this guy, this Christian, is kind of confused. Christianity will always bring two people together who don't like each other to not like Christianity. You ever notice that? Jesus did the same thing. Sadducees, Pharisees don't like each other, both don't like Jesus. But notice they insult him. They say he's a babbler. He's a guy that just says stuff and he says everything but says nothing. Now, Paul could have looked at them and said, well, I don't know what you're talking about, you stupid Epicurean, you stupid Stoic. Y'all are just both going to hell in a handbasket. I don't know why you're talking to me like that. Or he could have looked at him and said, son, we're about to have a problem. You keep talking to me like that. But notice what he's able to do. Notice the very next thing that takes place. That's the Areopagus, by the way. He moves to the Areopagus. Well, why didn't he just sit there and just argue with them right then and there? Why didn't he just sling insult after insult after insult of them until they stopped messing with him? Because Paul was willing to bypass the insult in order to talk to the person. Sometimes we have a hard time with that. Sometimes somebody come up to us and say, you believe that stupid Christianity stuff? You really believe that stuff? I'm like, come on. That is so outdated. And the next thing out of our mouth is, I'll show you outdated. And so we get into this battle of words and insults, and we miss the bigger picture. What would your conversations look like if you just had the mindset of, I'm after this soul, I don't care about an insult? Notice what it got Paul. It got Paul not just an audience with a couple of Stoics and Epicureans. It got him a much larger audience. And isn't that what we want? We need to go ahead and set our pride aside and make sure that as we look at somebody, I don't see skin, I don't see bone, I see soul. And so you'd be, and I would encourage you, if you go onto our Facebook page of the Daily Apologist, you'll see that every time that we post a graphic, an atheist makes a response. Some of them are good, some of them are nasty. But guess what? I don't care. I just want them to have a dialogue with me. And whether they know it or not, when they respond and when they are insulting me, I have a rule that I have about evangelism. And this is one that you need to add to your tool belt. The person that screams the loudest first loses. The person who screams the loudest first loses. Because once my temper is gone, then guess what? I've lost the person, I've lost the conversation. And Paul could have easily done that, but he didn't. So notice what takes place here is this. Paul makes a brilliant leap. Having observed the city, having connected with the city, having understood the people in the city, he is now going to communicate. And notice what it says there. It says, so Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, Men of Athens, I perceive in every way you are destined and bound for hell. What? What? I mean, shouldn't he have said that? I mean, wouldn't he be right in saying that? Wouldn't he be justified in saying that? Wouldn't he be the righteous one in saying that? Well, why doesn't he do it? I mean, he could have. He could have said it. Well, he's meeting people where they are so the gospel can change who they are. Men of Athens, I perceive in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed objects of your worship, I found also an altar with the inscription, To the unknown God. And what therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. Remember at the beginning of the chapter where he was sitting and he was waiting for Timothy and Silas, and he observed that there were many idols. And so what Paul does in a brilliant move of evangelism, he starts from where they are. We start with people from where we are. Way too often. Think about this for a second. I'm in a secular society and I walk up to an atheist and I say, hey, you should be a Christian. And they say, well, I don't even believe that. And we go, well, John 3:16 or hell. And they say, well, I don't even believe that book. And then he argues why the book is horrible, and I argue John 3:16. Well, I might as well take my head and pound it against the wall over and over and over again, because guess what? There's a chasm there, and I haven't met that person where they are. Or maybe I'm talking with, somebody in the denominational world, and I say, hey, Acts 2:38, and they say, hey, sinner's prayer, and I say, Acts 2:38, sinner's prayer, Acts 2:38, sinner's prayer. What have I not done? Maybe I should ask the question, well, why do you believe that? Instead of just saying, Acts 2:38, you dumb Baptist, I might as well just say, hey, tell me how you got to that. Explain to me where you were, or how did you get to this point? And meeting them where they are. And Paul says, Paul did that. He met people where they were. And notice what he says, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live where? In temples made by hands. Well, what were they doing? Constructing temples. Nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and boundaries. Well, what were they doing with God? They were constructing temples that were boundary markers for where they could worship God. And Paul says, no, God doesn't have boundary markers in a temple. He's the one that set the boundaries, not you. In their dwelling place that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way towards Him and find Him. And notice, he says, yet He's actually not far from each one of us. For in Him we live and we move and we have your being. And notice what he does not say here. Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't quote one Old Testament passage. He doesn't quote Jeremiah 31:31. Why? Because having connected with the city, having understood the people in the city, he understands that they don't care about Jewish prophecy. But what do they care about? Poetry. They care about their own poets. And so he connects with them by observing and being around them, and then he communicates in a way in which they, not Paul, will understand. You guys are very religious. But you don't set the boundaries for God. God sets the boundaries. And by the way, your own poets have even said that we're His offspring. And being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone or an image formed in the art or the imagination of men. What a brilliant move by Paul. Guys, the easiest way out of evangelism is to tell somebody they're going to hell right off the bat. The route that Paul wants you to take is to connect with people where they are, know who they are, and then communicate the gospel to them. And here's the great thing about this congregation. Here's the great thing about all congregations. You guys have spheres of influence even within your own city. There are people that you know and that you can connect with, that as much as Jeff might try to connect with them, he won't be able to. But you can. And that's what Paul does here. And notice, he said, the time of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he's fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and to this he was given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. So he meets them where they are, and once he springboards and says, we're all offspring of God, what does he do? He preaches the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Your evangelism ultimately has to come down to a conversation about, who do you think Jesus is? And that's a big question in today's society. Is he just a moral teacher? Is he just a good guy that walked the earth 2,000 years ago? Or is he who he said he was? The resurrected Son of God. And notice what takes place next. Now when they heard of the resurrection from the dead, some mocked, but others said, we'll hear you again about this. So Paul went out from their midst, but some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. And so these are the only three results you're ever going to get in evangelism. Some people are going to mock. Some people are going to say, we want to hear you again. And some people are going to put Christ on in baptism and become an adopted son or daughter in the Lord. Now, I don't know about you. I'm not really good at math. Okay? Like I said last night, I took Algebra 1 3 times in high school, okay? It's probably why I made a pretty good Marine for all the Army dogs out there. All right? But notice this. Some people said, we want to hear you again. Some people said, we'll join you and we will believe. Now, of the three outcomes, two of them are positive. We always rejoice when someone puts on the Lord in baptism. And I would encourage you this morning, if you're not a Christian, you need to ask the question, who do you think Jesus is? And you need to have that study with somebody. All right? But two, we'll also take, we want to hear more. So let me get this straight. 2 out of the 3 possibilities are positive, one's bad, yet we so focus on being mocked and being not liked that we forget that when Paul evangelized people, 2 out of the 3 results were positive. And if 2 out of 3 of the results are positive, when Paul evangelized, guess what? I need to stake my ground and say, I will take anybody that wants to be added to the Lord's church and anybody that wants to hear it again. I will take the repeat customer, so to speak. And that's who we need to be. And if we do that, guess what? If we connect and we communicate with our city, with our people, with the people in our sphere of influence, if we live evangelism as a lifestyle and not just as a calendar event, you will be amazed at what the Lord is going to do through you. And sometimes we get, the Gideon complex, right? Well, why me? I'm the youngest, and who am I? And I'm the least of my tribe. Listen, God has always used the weakest people to do the mightiest things in His name. And listen, I'm just a sinner who happens to be a saint and a son of God. Do not let the world tell you that you can't be an effective evangelist for God. Some of you might say, well, I'm too young. You're never too young. Some of you might say, well, I'm too old. Well, you would be shocked at what the wisdom of an older person can have. You'd be shocked at the impact that the wisdom of an older person can have on a young soul and a young mind. One of the ladies that got me started down the road to Christianity, when I first got there, she asked me who I was, where I was from. She knew my parents, and she looked at me and she said, I hope you come back because there's a lot of things in here that you need. I'm like, man, who is this old lady talking to me like that? But she was the sweetest lady in the congregation. So, Acts 17 teaches us one thing and one thing only. If you're going to be effective at evangelism, you need to connect and you need to communicate to your community. And I want you to look through the book of Acts this week and notice all of the times that the church grows. What are they doing? They're together, they're connecting, they're communicating in their community. And I would be remiss if I didn't end a sermon about evangelism with some evangelism, okay? I know that it's probably true that somebody in here, Christian or not Christian, feels a little broke, feels a little empty. It's been a tough couple of years, and you don't know where to go. Well, if you're here this morning, you're right where you need to be. You're right here where a group of people can connect with you, communicate with you, and can help you find the energy and the strength to get back to God. And if you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, oftentimes we say in the invitation, well, just come up here and be baptized. I want to pump the brakes on that just right now. If you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, I want to have a conversation. Let's have a conversation with the preacher, some elders, some deacons. I mean, I'm here till 2, 3, 4 o'clock. I'll have a conversation with you. I'll connect with you so that we can have a conversation about Jesus. Just think, I just want you to visualize this. Take a look around real quick. Just look at everybody else that's here. You see the empty space? That needs to be filled. Not just because we want to say we've had a record day here for people to attend. We want these pews to be filled with people who are far from God, who are now filled with a life in Christ. Take a look around again, just one more time. Those are all the people that can make it happen. Let's think about that as we stand, I guess, and sing. There you go.